Do you ever feel like you're being watched? It can happen when you're alone or with others. You feel this indescribable primal emotion, sort of like a mental itch that just tells you you're being stalked by something. This is exactly how I felt on the drive into Hiron Ministry National Forest. For those who are unfamiliar, this is a beautiful, massive park that's bordered almost entirely by Lake Michigan. I have many fond memories of my experiences here, but the story I'm about to share falls into an entirely different category. I was with my girlfriend of about 6 months at the time. We'll call her Diane. She was driving as we pulled off the interstate and neared the smaller roads that led into the designated camping area of the park. Originally, we planned to set up our campsite in the spot, but upon arrival, we noticed it was very crowded. After a bit of deliberating, we opted to grab our camping gear, which was only a minimalist tent, a few days' worth of food, and some bottled water, and we hiked a mile or so inland away from where the other campers would be situated. After all, we came out here to have some intimacy, and being surrounded by strangers cracking beers and partying did not really fit that bill. It was around 6 o'clock when we finally arrived at a suitable campground. It was a clearing just up a small hill, about 15 meters in diameter, surrounded by thick woods on every side, including where we entered from. We first heard it when we were setting up the tent. A thick, deliberate scream reminiscent of an animal in a good deal of pain. It rang out across the clearing. "What the hell?" Diane muttered. The sound ended as abruptly as it started, and almost as if it was in a cartoon, a flock of birds in the trees overhead took off, all flying back the direction we had come from. "What was that?" I asked, a barely noticeable quiver in my voice. "I don't know, maybe a deer or something," she replied. After giving her theory, Diane continued to pitch the tent, and I did too, though I found the sound hard to shake. After the tent was set up, Diane suggested we better get ready and get this firewood started before it gets too dark. As there was no existing fire pit, we had to kind of make one. I remember saying that I thought I saw good material just outside the clearing on our way in, when a strange noise came from overhead. It was gone in an instant. It sounded like a very large bird swooping just over our tent. We both heard it, and immediately looked up and around the area, though we could not see the thing that made the sound. Whatever this thing was, we didn't know. All we could tell was that this was something very large and big. Fast forward a few hours, and the sun was setting. After a rather grueling wood haul, we were able to get a proper fire going, and we were stereotypically toasting marshmallows over the flame while casually flirting and telling ghost stories. As I was biting into my charred sweet, me and her once again heard that scream. This time, it was much closer than before. The noise rang out in a way that made my ears throb, and I had to cover them with my hands. It lasted longer this time too, going for about 5 or 6 seconds. "Diane, what is that?" she yelled, as if trying to ask whatever made the scream. Though the sound was unnerving, I was more annoyed than scared at that point. "A real a-hole of a deer?" We both laughed. "I swear if it does that while I'm asleep, I'm just going to scream back." Our jokes dissolved the tension quickly, and we went back to toasting our marshmallows, watching the sky dissolve from purple into a deep blue ocean. The rest of that night was uneventful until we went to sleep sometime around 12 or 1 in the morning. I woke up to a loud thud outside, as if something heavy was dropped. "What was that?" She was still groggy, so I jostled her arm. "Diane, wake up. I think something's outside." "What? What do you mean? An animal or something?" She continued to lie there, so I said something to get her attention. "I'm scared." She sat right up in the tent, and I could see with my phone flashlight that she was very tired. "Okay, you want me to go look?" I guess. Without complaining, she got up out of the sleeping bag, taking my phone, and exited the tent. "Hello? Anyone out here?" she called jokingly as she shined her flashlight around the clearing. I watched her from the tent as she walked into the center of it, illuminating the area with the phone. Then, near the edge of the clearing, she spotted something. "Whoa, hey, come here!" I squinted, realizing I could barely see, and reached back to grab my glasses before getting out of the tent and walking over to her. This might sound strange, but the air felt heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm. There was also this faint smell of copper in the air. It grew stronger as I went over to her. Looking where she was shining the light, I saw what looked like a young fawn. At first I thought it was sleeping, completely unaware of us, until I saw the markings in its back. Deep in its fur were these gouges, about 2 feet apart. They were darkened, obviously soaked with blood. It looked almost as if the deer was picked up by some predatory bird. I found this confusing because I couldn't think of a prey bird around here that would be able to lift an animal that heavy off the ground. This thing was easily 50 pounds or more. "What the hell?" I said aloud. Even stranger, though, was the fact that the only markings on this animal were on its back. There were no other wounds, so whatever had done this to the deer didn't feed off it at all. It just killed it and left. "Babe, I really don't like this." Diane wrapped her arm around me, pulling me to her. I know. Let's get back to the tent. We'll get out of here as soon as the sun comes up." I nodded slowly, and we both began walking back to the tent. A few footsteps back, though, we heard a twig snapping. "Diane, shine the flashlight behind us," revealing nothing at first. She scanned the tree line, and to my horror, we saw something directly in front of us, maybe 20 feet away or so. It was a large humanoid figure. It glared at us, and whether it was because of the flashlight or this thing's natural disposition, its eyes appeared to be bright red glowing orbs. I was horrified. If I had to guess, I'd say the thing was between 8 and 10 feet tall. It was feathered in a deep gray coat. It stood staring at us. It didn't seem to have a separated head, but rather, its eyes were just plastered on the top of its body, sort of like an owl. Both me and my partner were stunned as we looked at this thing. Whatever it was then that it extended its arms or wings, revealing a very wide wingspan. It seemed to flow from its entire body, much like a moth. Without warning, it screamed at us. The sound was unbearable, thick, heavy, and blood-curdling, like a fire alarm amplified by 100. I collapsed to the forest floor, clutching my ears, as Diane held me. The last thing I remember was her saying my name as my vision faded to black. When I awoke, I was in the back of our car. I was surprised and sat straight up. Diane spotted me in the rearview mirror. "I'm glad you're awake," she said. As she spoke, I noticed my ears were ringing a great deal. I clutched my head in pain. "What the hell happened?" I grew pale in the face, remembering the creature from the night before. She kept her eyes on the road as she said, "The thing, it took off almost as soon as you blacked out, like a jet. It was insane. I took you back to the tent and waited until it was dawn before I booked it." "You mean you carried me all the way?" "I tried to wake you up a few times, but you were out cold. It wasn't too bad anyway, but I had to leave the tent." I sighed before nodding slowly. "Money we'll never get back." I paused, "And thank you for protecting me." I saw her smile in the rearview mirror. Without another word, to this day, we're still together. As strange as it is, the events seem to bring us closer. We talk about it often, using it as an anecdote when friends come over. It's a very healthy way to process an ordeal like this. We've been living together for quite some time now, and I see marriage as a very realistic future for us. As for the creature itself, I'm still unsure what it was. Based on its behavior and its striking physical form, I'd have to say my best educated guess would be that we encountered the Mothman, a humanoid cryptid that is said to have the body of a moth with glowing red eyes. According to the folklore, it's commonly seen as an omen before a major disaster. I still think about that night often. Honestly, I don't know if I would still be alive right now to write this story if it wasn't for my partner. I've told this story before, but it's worth repeating. I live in Central California in the valley, bordered on all sides by hills and mountain ranges. There were some great hikes, some campgrounds all around, and my ex and I chose to go hiking in the Sespe Wilderness. It's about a 2-hour drive from home, and it's basically hiking in the mountains southwest of Bakersfield, off the highway that leads to the Oji and the coast. Gorgeous country. very remote, no cell service. We were both archaeology hobbyists and decided to hike up past Piedras Blancas, a giant rock formation, and keep on that same trail paralleling the Sesame Creek in order to look for some Chumash pictographs. It's about a 5-mile hike, hilly terrain full of scrub bush and smaller trees. The trail is well maintained, and we were mostly alone out there. We reached an old campground about 3 to 4 miles out, and I'm feeling tired, so I stopped to rest at the campground. It's pretty much circular. There are several different campsites all in plain view of one another, and just to the east, there's a large rock formation that overlooks the creek. The rock formation is kind of flat, so I go over and lay down on the warm rocks so that I can listen to the water. He decides to continue further along the trail to see if he can locate the pictographs. I don't know how much time had passed when I hear the strangest howling scream I've ever heard. It went on for longer than a human should have been able to scream, and it alternated from being very low and guttural to high-pitched like a woman. So I shoot up off the rocks and start looking around, and I don't see anything. The sound didn't repeat, and I started to think that maybe I was just hearing an animal. All of a sudden, he comes crashing down the trail at full speed, thinking that he is hearing me scream. He describes hearing it a little differently. That sound I heard was not the sound he heard, but we both agree we heard something very strange we cannot explain away. We both kind of looked around the camp, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary, and decide together that it's time to head back. So, the sun is starting to set. It's late afternoon, and although it's still light out, it's that late afternoon golden hour kind of light. We're walking back and still on the trail that parallels the creek, and we start to hear boulders being thrown in the water. If you've ever been a kid by a body of water, you know what it feels like to pick up the heaviest rock you can and toss it in the water to hear the satisfying ka-plunk sound that heavy rocks make. This was heavier than that, and we knew it. We heard it several times, following us along the trail, and crashing sounds in the brush from across the creek. Whatever was throwing the rocks was following us, making sure we knew that we were not welcome. I have no idea what type of animal could throw very large boulders in the water like that. If it was a human, they did a damn fine job of pranking us because we were terrified. We hurried as fast as we could, and I ended up slipping on the trail and got a splinter in my arm that I wasn't able to dig out for months. We made it back to the parking lot near dark. I've only found one other online post about strange things happening in this Sesame Creek. I still don't know what we heard. This happened a long time ago, and was one of the first encounters I have ever had. I was 9 years old, staying with my grandmother on a reservation. I am Native American, free to be exact, and I was only supposed to be there for about a day or two. But then, it started to storm badly, lasting nearly 4 days. To this day, it remains one of the worst storms we have ever had. The power was out for maybe 3 days, so no lights, no stove, nothing. The layout of my grandma's house is important. I don't think you would even call it a house. It looked more like a trailer house, the kind you would see in Trailer Park Boys. It must have been the third night because the day after, we ate boiled eggs. My cousin, my aunt, and I were all sleeping in the living room. From where I was sleeping, you could see through the kitchen window. I was woken up by the sound of something talking in a strange voice. At the time, I couldn't think of what it was, but it reminded me of something. But now, after thinking about it for years, it sounded like a goat trying to speak English. I still don't know what it was trying to say, but I heard something roughly like, "Hey boys, hey." I just got chills typing that. At first I thought it was just my cousin being annoyed, but then I noticed there was a big figure standing outside of the kitchen window. It had its fist against the glass like it was trying to peer in and see what was inside. When I noticed it, it was banging on the window. Not hard enough to make a ton of noise, though. I saw the outline of horns, like big horned goats have, and fur covering its entire body from what I could see. Then, lightning flashed, and I saw its face. It's very hard to describe, but it looked like what you could imagine a goat man to look like. Maybe a bit more on the goat side, though. It had red eyes, but they were not glowing. It looked old and rough. Its fur was mostly gray with a little bit of brown. The window that it was at was about 6 feet above the ground or more. I don't really remember, so I would say this thing had to be 7 to 7.5 feet tall. Throughout the night, it just stayed in that same exact spot. But the banging slowly turned into scratching, and attempts to speak turned into growls and shouting. Lightning flashed a few times more, and every time I could see the anger on its face growing more and more. I eventually woke up my cousin crying. She came and lay with me until I fell asleep. I had a hard time falling asleep because every time I closed my eyes, I would see the eyes looking back at me. And when I finally did fall asleep, I had a nightmare involving the goat man. In my dream, I watched him walk over to our neighbor's house and brutally murder them, and come back with a decapitated head, swinging it around in my face. He was taunting me. Why, I still don't know. What's weird is that my cousin said that she couldn't see it, but she could hear it. The growling, scratching, everything. We talk about it often, and I remember at one point moving to another room and looking outside the window and seeing its full body, which was not like a minotaur, but a centaur. It noticed me, and that's when it ran back into the woods after I ran back into the living room. I forgot to mention that the morning after, we decided to check outside for evidence, and we found huge hoof prints going from the window to the woods. The footprints were probably the size of 2 open hands, rather big, way too big for any normal goat. Now I've heard countless stories on websites and listening to your show, but none of them come close to this night. It was the scariest encounter I've ever had, and I've seen a lot of weird things. I was in 3rd grade, staying in a small cabin with my family. My parents slept in one room with my younger brother in their bed, and my older sister in a sleeping bag on the floor. I slept on a couch that pulled out to a bed, with my best friend Colin, who they let bring with us. We stayed up very late playing Game Boy, and I had fallen asleep when it was his turn. At around 3 a.m., he woke me up by nudging me, and as I woke up, I asked him what he wanted. He shushed me and pointed out the window. Above the couch while we were sleeping, outside the window, we saw a swing set that was definitely taller than my dad. Towering over the swing set was this hairy, shadowy figure. It was very dark, and we were deep in the redwoods, with no outside light other than the moon. The cabin we were staying in had a bit of a clearing, so it wasn't quite as dark as the forest. I was frozen in shock. I had heard many stories of Bigfoot, but never thought it was real or that I would see one. The area was known for sightings, and they sold many souvenirs related to it. After staring at the creature for 60 seconds, I could see its eyes were looking back at us. It then walked downhill into the trees with long strides. We both confirmed with each other that we weren't dreaming, and it was positively amazing. We were both excited at this point, not scared. We must have both been exhausted from hiking all day and staying up late because we went to bed shortly after. The next morning we told my parents. They, of course, didn't believe us and said it was a nice story. We joked about how we both saw Bigfoot for years to come. Three buddies of mine and I went camping in the mountains of North Alabama on fall break in 2016. We trekked, I would probably say about a mile or so, maybe a little bit further up this hill close to my buddy's house. The Appalachian Mountains end in Alabama, so this could be an Appalachian horror story as well. Anyways, we had one more friend who was going to come with us, but he was going to be late. It was nearly pitch black at this point, and the 4 of us were just hanging around the fire, drinking and whatnot. Finally, our 5th friend Will calls and asks us if we're still going to meet him halfway, because it was so dark and he wouldn't be able to find us alone in this secluded spot. So, 2 of my buddies left to go meet him, leaving me and my friend, who I will call CJ for privacy reasons, alone. Everything was fine, and we were chatting when out of nowhere, we hear what sounds like some sort of mighty roar, which on first impression sounded like a yeti or something. We were skeptical but thought nothing of it at first. Not too long after that, we hear a cadence of footsteps all around us. They sounded like human footsteps. I want to say CJ starts to yell at whatever it could have been. The footsteps suddenly stop, and they were followed by a frightening moan. Not a moan like it was in pain, but an aggressive moan like a growl. But it wasn't really a growl. Us being drunk and not completely aware of what was happening, we decided to run after whatever it was. I know this is dumb. The moment we began to run after this thing, we see the silhouette of the creature running off on 2 feet and dropping down to all fours every other stride, almost like a monkey. But this thing didn't exactly look like a monkey. Seconds later, we got a phone call from our other buddies saying we need to get out of there ASAP. So, we book it down the hill, neither of us falling, surprisingly, and we make it back to our cars with the rest of our friends. Before we could even relay what we had just encountered, the 2 friends who left to meet us told us that they were certain something big was following them on the hike down. We do have black bears here, but not too many, and they try to stay away from humans, so it would be weird if it was a black bear, but not impossible. We all got into our cars and went back to our friend's house who lives nearby and shared our stories. The next day we go out to check out the campsite, and nothing looked out of place other than the fire had rocks on top of it, meaning something put it out. This story is 100% true, and I'd love to know what others may think we encountered. The woods by where my father grew up have old abandoned houses scattered throughout. The woods, I am from the Hudson Valley, New York, anyone from around the area should know, have old houses, or at least the foundations remaining. When he was younger, he and everyone else basically would climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up there to smoke and hang out, so a lot of things were smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, blanking on proper term, just a flat rock surface. You had to scale this. This was also his usual way down. So one night, he went up alone and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and he was lowering himself down the drop when he felt an odd presence and glanced up towards where he was standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance, because whatever it was, just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as very tall, lumbering above him, and covered in hair. It wasn't a bear, at least from the glance he got. Normally, you take things your parents tell you and have some doubts, and hearing his stories made it more believable. There is also the whole, you see what you want to see thing, so who knows? I'm terrified of heavily wooded areas, if I'm honest. Hi, my name is Daniel, and this encounter took place during Easter weekend. It should be known that I am 19, and I'm no stranger when it comes to alcohol, but I only have a few drinks if offered. You see, my dad wanted to spend Easter with my grandma, who lives by herself in a small cottage in the Ozarks, up in Missouri. The only thing around her house for miles are a few farms and a large forest. Whenever you go to visit my grandma, she would always tell us about how she would be hearing eerie noises coming from the forest at night. We got there in the late afternoon on Saturday, and me and my dad wanted to share a few drinks before we all headed off to bed to get ready for the egg hunt my grandma had planned for my niece and nephew. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up due to the call of nature and headed downstairs to use the bathroom. After I finished, I made my way back to the bedroom before stopping as I heard my dad call out for me. I went to where I heard it coming from and noticed it was coming from outside. So I began to make my way to the front door before noticing something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, on the couch, was my dad, who had a few empty beer bottles on the floor around him, but was very much passed out. And that's when I heard it. It was my dad's voice calling my name, yet it sounded off somehow. It sounded like someone recorded my dad's voice and played it over a voice modifier. It just sounded so weird, and it was coming from right outside the door. I slowly approached the front door before I stopped and went to go take a peek out the window, when all I saw was pitch black, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing at the door. At first, I thought it was a person, but when I saw that this thing had horns on its head like some kind of demon, I'm not sure how. but I swear this thing knew I was looking at it because as soon as I got a good look at it, it turned and stared at me with these piercing red eyes before saying something that chilled me to the bone. "Daniel, please let me in." At that point, I ran throughout the house, making sure every single window and door, or any entrance at all, was locked tight. Surprisingly, no one heard a single thing, and I did not get a wink of sleep that night. Easter came and went, although the whole time I felt like I was being watched. And as we left my grandma's house, there in the tree line, I saw it. It stood 7 feet tall, from what I could guess, and was covered in messy black hair. It was built like a man, and I'm sure if I could see its feet, it would have had hooves. The head reminded me of a goat and an aged homeless man at the same time. Before I could stare any longer, the creature retreated back into the forest. I've never told my family of this encounter, but I'm just glad I hadn't opened that door. If I did, I probably wouldn't be here today writing this. But now, I am filled with concern because that thing is still out there. And what if it decides to go after my grandma next time? If you live in the Ozarks in Missouri, or plan on taking a trip there, I do caution you to be careful out there. And if you hear something calling you at night, definitely do not go check it out. You never know what could be lurking on the other side of that door. It was June 1987, because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeast Idaho. It was a pretty big place with lots of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker over the place had just quit, and my girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker. But the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there. Free food, satellite TV, and all. I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I'd never been out west, so I took him up on it. And it sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading, exploring, playing with the dogs, and riding the horse. It was completely uneventful until that night. After the knocking stopped and the dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because there were 2 German shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on my nightstand. I'd been drinking a little but was not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors a few miles away. I was kind of thinking that someone had just driven down the wrong driveway. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and saw a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was around 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone with that make or model of car. He said he didn't, and he called the police directly. The police show up, ask me a few questions, and walk around the property for an hour or so. The car was locked, and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing, and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. I don't know how long he was missing, or when he was reported missing, or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know much about it either. After about a month, I went back home. The girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out of town a few months later and asked her if she ever found out what happened to the guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead, apparently killed himself 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after that. He'd killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found, and who found him, and I got nothing. And I never saw her again. A friend of mine and I were hiking through the woods. It was dark out, and we were beginning to head back towards home when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and kneeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got the feeling that we were being watched. We tried to shrug it off and keep moving further down the trail. We saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided, stupidly, that we were going to get to the bottom of this. So we started after it, and it started charging. We screamed and it stopped, and then took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took off after it. I ran for a bit through the woods until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched as another popped up beside it, then another. And then I heard movement to the side of me, realizing that whatever these things were, they had surrounded me. I quickly noped out of there in the direction I left my friend. So, I know that sounds like the creepy part, but it gets weirder. My friend wasn't there where I'd left him, so I called out to him, and he responded a little away, followed by, "You've got to see this." So I followed his voice and came to a clearing that was bright as hell. I'm floating around the clearing, will-edged balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda. These were pure white light. We looked at each other, and then hightailed it back to the trail and went home. It was definitely the strangest and scariest thing I've ever witnessed.